In a small town in the western part of the country, there stood an old, abandoned hotel that everyone called the Twilight House. Once, travelers stayed there, but for decades, no one dared to even step inside. Legend had it that the last owner of the hotel, Mr. Gregory, disappeared without a trace after a terrifying night when screams and the sound of breaking glass were heard in the building. One autumn evening, three friends, Andrew, Sarah, and Mike, decided to film a video for their YouTube channel about urban legends. They had heard of the Twilight House and decided to spend the night there. Their preparations were thorough: flashlights, a camera, extra batteries. Sarah brought an old tape recorder to capture any possible sounds. When they arrived at the hotel, dusk had already enveloped the building in fog. The door creaked as Mike pushed it open. Inside, everything was covered in dust, cobwebs, and an eerie coldness that seemed to seep into their bones. The group decided to split up. Sarah stayed on the first floor while Andrew and Mike headed upstairs. On the first floor, Sarah began hearing strange noises. At first, it sounded like rustling leaves, but then she realized it resembled muffled breathing. She turned on the tape recorder and quietly asked, "Is anyone here?" There was no reply, but when she played back the recording, a voice clearly said, "Leave." Meanwhile, Andrew and Mike found a room that seemed to have been the owner's office. On the desk lay an old guest book. Mike picked it up to show Sarah, but suddenly felt someone shove him. He turned around, but no one was there. Andrew laughed, thinking his friend was joking, but at that moment, the door to the room slammed shut on its own. Sarah joined the boys and told them about the recording. Mike, still shaken, began reading the names aloud from the guest book. As soon as he read the name Gregory Stevens, the flashlight flickered and the tape recorder turned on by itself. It started playing sounds. First a whisper, then a scream, which ended in a loud crash. Suddenly, all three of them heard footsteps downstairs. They decided to go down and check. Their flashlights barely illuminated the space, but the footsteps were unmistakable. On the first floor, the friends saw the silhouette of a man in a hat, standing with his back to them. Sarah shouted, "Who are you?" The silhouette slowly turned, revealing a face that was nothing but a black void. The figure began moving toward them, and the friends, without hesitation, ran for the exit. As they fled the hotel, Andrew dropped the camera, but he didn't stop to pick it up. They reached their car and sped away. Once they were safe, the group reviewed the footage they had recorded. On the final video shot in the hotel, the figure in the hat stood before them, whispering, "You came for me, and now I'll come for you." Since that night, strange things began happening to the friends. Sarah was plagued by nightmares in which the same silhouette stood by her bed. Mike heard footsteps in his house, even when he was alone. And Andrew disappeared a month after that night. His last message to his friends was brief: "He's here." The Twilight House Hotel still stands in the same place. And if you decide to visit, remember, some doors are better left unopened.
The Forgotten Tunnel. In the small, unremarkable town of Blackridge, there was a legend that no one dared to speak of. Beneath the town's abandoned railway station lay a tunnel, sealed off and forgotten for decades. The older residents whispered tales of people who entered the tunnel and never came back. Most dismissed the stories as myths, but curiosity has a way of tempting the brave or the foolish. One chilly autumn evening, a group of 4 friends, Claire, Mike, Julia, and Eric, decided to investigate the tunnel. They had heard the stories growing up and thought it would be the perfect setting for a thrilling adventure. Armed with flashlights, a camera, and an old map of the railway system, they made their way to the station. The station was a relic of a bygone era. Its walls were covered in graffiti, and weeds grew through the cracked concrete floor. The entrance to the tunnel was hidden behind a rusted metal gate. With a little effort, they pried it open, the screech of the hinges echoing ominously. "Are we sure about this?" Julia asked, clutching her flashlight tightly. Her voice wavered, betraying her nerves. Come on, it'll be fun, Mike said with a grin, already stepping into the darkness. We'll be in and out before you know it. The air inside the tunnel was damp and cold. Their footsteps echoed, bouncing off the curved walls. The faint smell of mildew and decay hung in the air. The flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing rusted tracks and debris scattered across the floor. The further they went, the quieter it became. Even the distant hum of the town above seemed to vanish. About 15 minutes in, Eric paused. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The group stopped, straining to hear. At first, there was nothing but the sound of their breathing. Then, faintly, they heard it, a low, guttural sound, like a distant growl. "It's probably just the wind," Mike said, though his confident tone faltered. They pressed on, but the tension was palpable. The growling sound grew louder, more distinct. It was not the wind. It was rhythmic, almost like breathing. Then, Claire noticed something on the walls. Scratches, deep and jagged, as if something with claws had dragged them along the surface. "Guys, I don't think this is a good idea," she said, her voice trembling. "We've come this far," Mike replied, though even he was starting to look uneasy. As they turned a corner, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. In the center was an old, rusted train car, its windows shattered, and its metal sides covered in strange symbols. The air felt heavier here, oppressive. "Let's get a closer look," Mike suggested, pulling out his camera. But as he stepped forward, the growling sound turned into a low, menacing laugh. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Who's there?" Eric shouted, spinning around with his flashlight. There was no response, only the sound of shuffling footsteps in the shadows. The friends huddled together, their flashlights darting around the chamber. Then they saw it, a figure just at the edge of the light. It was tall, impossibly thin, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the flashlight beams. "Run!" Claire screamed, and they bolted back the way they came. The sound of heavy footsteps followed them, growing louder and faster. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, and the air grew colder with each step. Julia tripped over a piece of debris, falling hard to the ground. Eric stopped to help her, but the figure was closing in. It let out a guttural roar, and for a moment, its full form was visible in the light, a grotesque skeletal creature with skin stretched tight over its bones and a gaping mouth filled with jagged teeth. Mike grabbed Julia's arm, pulling her to her feet. Together, they ran, adrenaline fueling their desperate escape. The growls and footsteps seemed to fade as they finally reached the entrance, stumbling out into the cold night air. They slammed the gate shut behind them, their hearts pounding. For a moment, they stood in silence, gasping for breath. The creature did not follow. "What the hell was that?" Claire whispered, tears streaming down her face. No one had an answer. The camera Mike had been carrying was missing, lost somewhere in the tunnel. They didn't go back for it. From that night on, none of them spoke about what they saw. The legend of the forgotten tunnel remained, but now they knew the truth. Some mysteries are better left undiscovered.